a letter to earnest dissident right activists. Behold the awesome power of fiat currency and elite overproduction. To kick off this new era on Substack, I intend to produce a series of letters directed at the persistent political divides, both online and off. My goal generally will be to clarify the controversies as I see them, state my objections, and if possible, discover a way of moving forward. If our discourse indeed needs to be radically transformed, just as our society is radically transforming before our very eyes, perhaps these essays might work as a springboard for better discussion that can get beyond stale talking points. If not a way of achieving ideological synthesis, then at least as a way of avoiding common digressions that consume so much of our time. First, on the docket today, I'm taking on the infamous pleb activist versus aristocrat pacifist debate that has plagued my side of the dissident right during the early months of 2021. Here, the disagreement is simple. The activist types think that post-2020, long-term, large-scale political victory is still possible through the use of mass movements and democratic political pressure. The aristocratic pacifist types, myself very much included, think that any non-progressive mass movement is futile at a large scale, and that the focus of non-progressive cultural energy needs to be directed elsewhere. Typically, the activist versus pacifist debate exists at the back end of reading neo-reactionary authors and generally witnessing the persistent failures of conservative politics in 2020. In light of this, the activist types want to get beyond the theory and achieve something politically in the real world. The pacifist types see proposals to re-enter partisan politics as essentially going backwards, rehashing failed GOP approaches to the American political problem. Probably more heat than light has been generated from this disagreement, and at this point I'm convinced that much of the controversy comes down to a descriptive confusion about the scope of our problem. Could a restatement of my read on events clarify things? Since I haven't been able to put the objections to bed via conversation, perhaps a plain text description of the problems, which we do agree on, and the methods towards victory, which we don't agree on, could clarify things for all parties. Part 1. The problem at hand. The issue facing all modern dissidents is how any non-progressive political cause can win permanently in the modern world. More pointedly, the problem is that non-progressive causes, whatever their truth or virtue, stand virtually no chance of achieving any long-term success. The cause of this failure seems to be institutional in nature, and its specific functioning is, for my money, best described by the modern NRX writers. Again, I'm not expecting much disagreement at this stage. After all, both activist types and pacifist types have taken on the NRX critique of standard conservative politics, but in case we're having difficulty remembering all of this, I will provide a brief review here. The fixture of power that makes progressive ideas win, and keep winning, is a collective consensus that NRX dubs the Cathedral. As mysterious as it sounds, the Cathedral is simple shorthand for the collective consensus-forming epicenter of modern society, usually being broken down into the unelected government, the media, and the academy. Even though the Cathedral is constituted of myriad different, ostensibly independent institutions, it is worthwhile to refer to it as a singular entity because it exhibits consistent and predictable political consensus and direction. The ruling ideological consensus of the Cathedral is a post-Christian materialist progressivism. The ruling political direction of the Cathedral is leftward, towards a greater material realization of care-based ethics and the liberation of human hedonic desire. Here, an illustrative example can be taken from Curtis Yarvin to demonstrate how the Cathedral affects political affiliation across time. If we were to observe modern elite universities, one will notice that it is very difficult to determine whether Harvard or Yale is more left-wing, in any objective sense. Yet for some reason, it is very easy to determine that both institutions are objectively more progressive than their past selves. Both Harvard and Yale seem to be moving at some uniform speed in a common political direction, carried by a kind of cultural tide. That tide is the ideology of the Cathedral, the consensus of elite opinion makers. If we accept this description of the Cathedral, it naturally follows that long-term progressive defeats are almost impossible within the reach of this consensus. Conversely, for any non-progressive movement to win a permanent victory, the Cathedral must either be destroyed or given some hard reboot. So far so good? Great. But before I go further, I want to re-emphasize the two key qualities of the Cathedral which are many times forgotten by activists eager to fight back. First, the Cathedral is decentralized. There is no leader of the Cathedral, there is no cabal or conspiracy running its consensus. Don't waste your time looking for an inner party. It doesn't exist. Second, the Cathedral is evolved. While some of its parts are indeed designed to perform certain tasks, the majority of its bulk is comprised of individual actors, independently cooperating to increase their own share of wealth, power, and status. These two observations are critical in tandem because they characterize the real difficulty in understanding the nature of our common problem. Although in many ways the Cathedral acts like a single organization, it is not in fact planned or centralized at all. The Cathedral has no concept of its own existence, power, or purpose. Nevertheless, if you attack its interests, every one of its pieces will work together and fight you. Here, I might attempt to invent a new term, de-designed, or Darwinianly designed, to describe a fixture that is not actually designed, but might as well be for the practical purposes of fighting it. For instance, a rhino's horn is not designed to disembowel a human. The horn is the product of an evolutionary selection that helps the rhino go around the Serengeti, eating plants and making baby rhinos. Still, this lack of design purpose will be meaningless once the critter is bearing down on you. The rhino is de-designed to kill humans, and only a fool thinks it won't run him through. In a similar way, only a fool thinks he can go after critical race theory at his HR department and not expect the totally independent bodies of the elite universities and the mainstream press to fight back against his efforts. Do we agree on this at least? This is the core NRX thesis that everyone always wants to get beyond. So let's get beyond the basics and start addressing what the activist types want to achieve. Part 2. Activist Attacks on the Periphery. Here is the point in the essay that will probably bring me the most grief, restating honestly the positions of the activist types. Even with some charity, I find the task difficult. Most dissident activists in 2021 don't like talking about specific strategy. However, from what I can tell, listening to them talk, their strategy is the basic counter-progressive strategy that has been attempted in America, and less so in Europe, for the last 100 years. Step 1. Build coalitions of populist malcontents in the hinterlands. Step 2. Organize a ragtag political class comprised of elite defectors and aspiring peasants with little support in the centers of power. Step 3. Attempt to gain control of the government and then overthrow the ruling class and thought leaders who actually run the place. GOP style in a nutshell. Rinse and repeat. I suppose it's not nearly that simple. A lot of our new dissident activists have a distinctive style that does set them aside from the Republicans of the 1980s. They have a gruff distrust of all things establishment. They make accusations of treachery, maybe even treason, against respected thought leaders. They openly disregard the classical rules of polite discourse, and they make dark predictions, not prescriptions, mind you, that if sanity isn't restored, the country might soon be plunged into civil war. But of course, at this stage we run into a problem, because none of these listed sentiments are remotely new in American history. Each is an old-as-dirt political trope, well documented in rural discontents, going all the way back to the 18th century. While the directness of this approach to politics is refreshing in contrast to the gelded, conservative establishment, the historical track record of movements using this style is less than sterling. With a few weird exceptions, Western political elites have never been unseated by peasant movements or revolts. And since the 1940s, most Western elites haven't even had to take the possibility seriously. The activist types of 2021 are struggling with the twin realizations. First, that all past right-wing activism against the progressive cathedral has failed, and second, that there really is no difference between their approach and the approaches of failed movements in the past. And here, I need to tip my hat to the eternal optimism of Western man. Persistent failure is no obstacle. Or, in the immortal words of Tobias Fouquet, it never works, but it might for us. But snark aside, I will admit here that a poor track record is not sufficient to dismiss this question of activism against the cathedral. There is, of course, a first time for everything. Rome was undefeated until it was defeated by the Huns. The sun never set on the British Empire until it finally did, and the housing market kept on going up until it finally didn't. History is strewn with the broken forms of impassable barriers and invincible armies. And people need space to try things, even things that have failed again and again before. Still, before I ante up for the next round of right-wing activism, could we try to learn from the past? Could we describe the barriers to successful right-wing movements and try to see if our current dissident right coalition looks anything like the historical silver bullet that finally takes the vampire down? Let's start by asking why most attacks on the cathedral fail. Well, for starters, the cathedral is big and resilient. Really big and really resilient. Most of its institutional body is just bulk, accumulated fixtures totally unnecessary to its core functioning. Trying to attack the cathedral in broad strokes by lashing out at a random institution is like firing a .22 caliber rifle into the side of a blue whale and hoping to explode its heart. Even if you chance upon the exact right vector to its aorta, the damn thing is surrounded by layer after layer of blubber, superfluous to the functioning of the whale's circulatory system. Take a shot at it if you must, but I'm not going to be expecting a kill. And in the meantime, for those Melville fans out there, the whale doesn't exactly enjoy being shot at, and as nature designed it, the Leviathan has more than a few ways of crushing random pissants in the process of antagonizing its form. Likewise, in the case of the cathedral, the institutional blubber comprises nearly all of the organizations that ordinary people regularly come in contact with. Here, I'm referring to things like the establishment media, the local teachers' unions, and the junior professors who babysit undergrads in their diversity, inclusion, and equity seminars. Of course, all of these institutional appendages are designed to strike non-progressives to their core, but conversely, none of them are even close to the core of the cathedral itself. Remove or destroy any one, and the system as a whole will simply go on functioning without a hitch. If you humiliate a junior professor, defund a local teachers' union, or even get a mainstream journalist fired, nothing about the cathedral's operations will be changed at all. And this robustness is easy to see if you look. The only thing cathedral institutions consistently do well, other than destroy right-wingers that is guard themselves against attacks on their accumulated power and money. After all, that's what they have been de-designed to do, isn't it? Unlike red state peasants, cathedral functionaries aren't in the habit of hitting the snooze alarm while interlopers funnel their wealth and privilege out the back door. And even if a counter-progressive force does prevail in one specific instance, would any damage it does be meaningful? Not likely in this age, where we see established bureaucracies healing from political attacks like Terminators regenerating in real time. It turns out that resilience is not actually a hard task when your only inputs are government subsidies and overeducated midwits. Behold the awesome power of fiat currency and elite overproduction. Everyone who has recently lived in a metropolitan area knows this firsthand. For each vacancy in the institutions under consideration, journalists, teachers, union leaders, junior professors, there are hundreds of millennials in line, progressive arts degree in hand, waiting to become relevant in some minor way. And it's all the better if said vacancy was caused by some reactionary boogeyman whose existence justifies their activist approach to power. Heck, in the Keynesian creative destruction sense, you might even be helping the cathedral burn off its excess boomers, removing old driftwood to allow new and more vital energy to fill the gaps. So far, we see that activism against peripheral cathedral institutions, while possibly a cathartic way to strike back against irritating and pretentious busybodies, is not actually an avenue to achieving lasting political change. Part 3. Activist Attacks on the Core. Increasingly, on the distant right, there does seem to be an understanding that any activist efforts have to be more focused on what matters. So is there a better approach? Perhaps. While it is true, in an ultimate sense, that all apparatuses of the cathedral are connected like a circulatory system, Like a circulatory system, there is an upstream and a downstream. Some elements are essential, upstream, and others are peripheral and non-essential, downstream. Upstream death or damage to the heart will cause inevitable death and damage to the finger. Conversely, very few injuries to the finger can conceivably result in damage to the heart. If an attack on the cathedral is going to be fatal, the targets must be essential, full stop. But then, which institutions in the cathedral are actually essential? Here, some intuitive analysis is needed. Warning, your results might vary. But still, using a little common sense and some basic rules of thumb, we can paint a general picture of the situation. If the cathedral is indeed the primary consensus-forming and information-sharing system of our society, we would expect its essential institutions to have several properties. 1. Essential institutions should, more often than not, be the originators of new ideas and policies. 2. Essential institutions should have functions that are hard or even impossible to replicate by non-essential institutions inside the cathedral. If suddenly destroyed or disbanded, these things would be difficult to recreate from scratch, even with almost infinite resources. 3. The workings of essential institutions should hold the interests of rich and powerful people. These places, of course, are the ultimate influencers, and powerful people can't afford to not pay attention to them. Of course, just like a heart, these core essential institutions are not necessarily the originators of all new concepts. They do have inputs as well as outputs, but we should expect to see ideas take a long time to filter into essential institutions and a short time to filter out of them. For instance, it took 3 decades for critical race theory to completely conquer the upper reaches of the Ivy League, less than 5 to completely filter down to all private human resource departments in corporations nationwide. Using these intuitive rules and going down the line, we can immediately see that very few institutions are in any way essential to the cathedral. Almost no part of the mainstream media is essential, a fleetingly small part of the unelected government, and only the smallest number of elite universities fit this description. For example, using my own back-of-the-envelope calculations, the institutions marked as essential come down to super-elite research and educational institutions, such as Harvard, Yale, or Berkeley, quasi-independent academic peer circles, such as Nature magazine, Science magazine, etc., some neoliberal NGOs, the World Economic Forum or the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and a few semi-government bodies, the Federal Reserve, the CIA, etc. Your analysis might vary, but if your list looks anything like mine, a certain picture is coming into focus concerning the radical insulation of these core fixtures. Are any of these institutions directly accountable to the American population? Does any typical red state dissident have leverage over these organizations? Does the typical dissident even come in contact with these bodies regularly? The answer to these questions is clearly no, no, and no. Call me a pessimist, but the opportunities for a successful pushback on this vector seem rather limited. But here, I can expect a disagreement. Even if the activist types follow me descriptively, I know what their retort will be to my conclusions. Dave, all of the organizations you mentioned get funding and talent from the American people. Most of them are either part of the government or exist at the behest of our government. Certainly the answer is to use good old-fashioned American populism to take control of the state and use it to cut off these institutions at the knees. They rely on us. We can starve the beast. It's possible. Well, yes, it's possible, on paper at least. But again, none of these institutions are particularly exposed to public scrutiny, and every one of the listed organizations has entire departments of 150-plus IQ professionals whose only job it is to figure out how to lobby for new funding and to keep the funding they already have. What is the right-wing activist answer to this level of institutional security? To stick the congressional fiscal hawks on them? These are the people who at their height couldn't defund the lumbering exoskeleton of New Deal programs like the Tennessee Valley Authority. Now, in their decline, we expect these people to torpedo the funding to the respected organizations that do cancer research plan third world famine relief, and educate the children of the entire elite class, including those of their colleagues? Come on. The same can be said for longer-term attempts to starve the beast of native talent and other soft support that these institutions need to function. I understand the emotion, but on any realistic assessment, this proposal is just a failure to come to terms with the realities of globalism. Whatever Harvard, Yale, and the World Economic Forum lose in red state talent or support, they can easily pick up from the burgeoning middle classes in China and India. Perhaps some people think that the third world will have a lower quality talent pool to deliver. Perhaps, but any decrease in quality can be solved by a billion more people to choose from. And unless something radically changes, we can expect these institutions to have foreign support. Harvard and Yale now train the ruling classes of India, China, and every African country. An institutional administrator with an elite Rolodex that spans the ruling classes of 5 continents who can't defend this funding from poorly focused popular revolts really sucks at his job. At this point, we need to talk about some hard truths. The cucked, mainstream right of the Reagan era was 1,000 times more powerful and focused than the dissident right of 2021. And even at the height of its power, it was nowhere near to disrupting the support of these core cathedral institutions. The entirety of Red America could probably disappear, and as long as food production was maintained, not a single cathedral core institution would feel particularly impacted. And finally, despite suffering the full contempt of conservative America for more than 30 years, the Progressive Cathedral, and the left wing that it represents, has suffered more from its own mistakes and stupidity than from any action planned and taken by right-wing activists. Part 4. But what if the cathedral killed itself? Inevitably, I've noticed that this is the part of the conversation where most distant activist plans divert to 6-dimensional underwater backgammon. Simple first-order plans to use direct activism to destroy the cathedral inevitably become convoluted second-order plans to help the cathedral destroy itself. Often, these plans are accompanied by vague allusions to lawfare, or whatever strategic-sounding words are popular on right-wing Twitter today. And the agenda always seems quite clever, at least when it's posted on social media. Again, I understand the emotion here, but this all seems completely naive. Any one of these fantastical false flag operations inevitably relies on the cathedral developing a very specific type of schizophrenia that can be manipulated by right-wing operators. While it is true that a certain type of schizophrenia has taken hold of the cathedral, the essential parts of the body are still healthy, and the cathedral isn't exactly known for letting internal political disagreements destroy its core power. Just because your enemy is going a little bit crazy doesn't mean you have control over the situation. The popular idea that internal battles within the cathedral can be engineered by right-wing activists becomes even more ridiculous when people propose progressive moral consistency as a tool by which they might lead powerful institutions around by the nose and force them to live up to their own contradictory standards. Remind me again, why would anyone assume that progressives care about consistency? Have we come so far in 2021 that only months after abandoning the hypocrisy strategy, we immediately divert to relying on the non-existence of any hypocrisy to make our future plans for activism seem rational? To all those fans of my vlog between 2016 and 2020, perhaps I should apologize here. When I said that we shouldn't be obsessed with progressive hypocrisy, this was because progressive hypocrisy was obvious, not because it didn't exist. But again, I understand this is getting abstract. Any one of these jiu-jitsu political ideas can be much more realistically refuted simply by writing out their steps in sober realistic terms, calling out each of the decision makers and required decisions. For those of you at home with their own pet project to destroy the cathedral with that one weird trick, I invite you to follow along with the exercise. Start from your proposed tactic, something that a real counter-progressive community could actually accomplish, and then list all of the steps, ending with the total destruction of one or more of the cathedral's essential institutions. If this exercise is completed with any amount of realism, what you will see in front of you is a long list of decision makers, each who need to endorse a policy that is diametrically opposed to his cultural and financial interests. Any break in this chain and your idea is confetti. Every link in this chain can reasonably be expected to fail. Once more, I think we're at an impasse. Part 5. The Dying Leviathan. And yet have we explored all the options? Here I anticipate another objection from the peanut gallery. But Dave, haven't you said previously that the Cathedral is losing its grip on power? Isn't it actually decaying? Isn't this an opportunity, a chance for right-wingers to move forward and push them over the edge? Well, indeed, the Cathedral is teetering a bit in its foundations. It's certainly not as young as it used to be. Perhaps it's even in the early stages of dying. We should note here that this decline is entirely due to its own stupidity and not right-wing activism. Still, I would be remiss if I didn't admit that in some sense, the trolling of institutions by right-wingers has contributed somewhat to the institutional decline of the establishment. Nevertheless, every time I hear about this accelerationist solution, plainly advocated for by right-wingers, I can't help but cringe. Why is this? Well, in addition to courting a type of tactical nihilism, something Christians, at least, should always be very cautious of doing, accelerationism, as a right-wing strategy for victory, seems to fundamentally misunderstand the nature of the culture war in 2021. Here, a sober look at how progressives see things might be illustrative. Although many in red states rarely see this, post-2020, even the most dyed-in-the-wool progressives are starting to feel a vague sense of dread. This isn't the world they wanted, and there is a creeping suspicion that eventually they won't be able to hold things together. And if this nascent attitude of despair is hard to read, I have indeed seen it in my own life, being able to drop the term late progressivism into casual conversations with lefties, and strangely enough, getting only plaintive nods in response. These days it is clear to see that, while the left reigns like a king over all institutions that matter, the sword of Damocles dangles above them and may soon drop. Optimism, once an eternal font for progressives in the Golden State, is now running dry, and everyone feels that something dark is on the way. And yet, just as you might think that progressives have nothing good to look forward to, when the subject of conversation shifts to the topic of the culture war against the right wing, all of this existential dread melts away and is quickly replaced by smirking triumphalism. How can a people, so bleak about their own future, be so confident and happy about their coming victory over their enemies? Well, as might be obvious, unlike successfully governing a state, the culture war is a zero-sum contest between two sides. And for all the problems of the modern left, it is obvious to everyone here, liberal, conservative, or otherwise, that the traditionalist right is dying faster than the progressive alternative. This might be just an entertaining distraction for leftists wanting to ignore their own home's catastrophic decline, but for someone like myself, chiefly interested in imagining and achieving a non-progressive future, the question of how to survive seems by far the most important task. In addition to their obvious political problems, non-progressive groups face the much more pressing issue of maintaining their own existence. Not only do we have to contend with the corrosive effects of modernity, the grasping bugmen who increasingly rule mainstream power centers love nothing more than to roast traditionalist symbols and people to distract their own political malcontents from the blinding obviousness of their own incompetence. The progressive cathedral may be fading, but like most apex predators, it becomes more dangerous the closer it is to death. And let me tell you, progressives have no intention of allowing anything they perceive as right-wing or traditional to survive their own decline. Will they succeed? It's hard to say, but it is this core question of survival that needs to be the focus of all non-progressives going forward. Here, in the twilight of modernity, the culture war is a game of competitive survival, a game of last man standing. And insofar as the right wing has lost its credibility in this contest, the problem owes less to direct progressive attacks and more to the perception that non-progressive modes of existence just cannot prevail in a post-industrial technological age. Sure enough, dying or not, The right wing can always win the game of last man standing by killing its opponent. As I mentioned at the start, no permanent political large-scale victory can be achieved until the cathedral dies, one way or the other. But unless it procures the death of this enemy quickly, very quickly, right-wing activism doesn't address the larger problem before us. As I've illustrated, the probability of any direct attack instantly resulting in the cathedral's death are slim. And once we discard low-probability strategies to win quickly, our gradual approaches to accelerationism through petty trolling don't actually reassure people that anything right-wing will survive the flailing viciousness of the late progressive ruling class. Dissident activists aside, almost no one honestly thinks that the right can compete with the progressive establishment in terms of politics. And unless we do something radically different, the right isn't going to survive the collapse of that establishment either. Part 6. Get busy living or get busy killing. Ultimately, if you're an activist type and still reading this letter, I doubt that I've convinced you. You have a plan and you trust it will work. Is it an attack on the periphery? An attack on the core? A direct attack using government defunding? An indirect attack to encourage the cathedral to kill itself? Did I miss any of the options? Snark aside, I can imagine your objections. Dave, we all know that our plan isn't perfect, but it must be better than what you're doing. Building culture? Finding networks? Looking for new ideas? That doesn't even address what people are complaining about. That doesn't actually achieve what people want. Certainly, this is good criticism, and not criticism that I can fully answer in this letter. But my point with this essay is less to win the argument than to show how I got to my position and where I actually think the dilemma lies. As you might have guessed, I don't think right-wing activism works post-2020, and I think our time might be better spent strengthening our own communities. My adversaries obviously disagree. Everyone will, at some point, have to decide where they want to put their effort, and so it's not bad that the nature of the disagreement is made explicit. In fact, to be succinct, we might express our dilemma paraphrasing Shawshank's Andy Dufresne. It comes down to a simple choice: get busy living or get busy killing. For those activists still on the warpath, I have no quarrel with your cause. If you have the kill shot on the cathedral, then go ahead and take it. I'm certainly not stopping you. In fact, I'll even buy you a beer once you stand triumphant over the corpse of Leviathan. Please, I beg you, make me obsolete. Do you think I want to be doing this? I would happily be proved an irrelevant nerd if it were the price tag to live in a sane world. As you probably know, speaking out as a non-progressive in the modern world is a dangerous game, and I assure you that I'm not doing this for my health. My goal isn't to dissuade you from activism. I just don't want people to waste their time, or for that matter their lives, trying to get something that they probably can't achieve. The truth is, beyond what I have written here, I really don't want to be having this conversation anymore. It's not that I find the repetition boring, it's just that the implications are distasteful. Can we not agree to disagree? And here is where things get a little spicy, because whatever the activist types say about us eggheads, it's hard to miss the fact that most of the time, it's they who seek us out, and not the other way around. Regardless of what I say here or in any previous essay, people keep approaching me with their new brilliant plans for a right-wing takeover. I explain why I'm not interested, and then the angry words inevitably begin to flow. The terms defeatist, cuck, or coward are the most popular insults, even though I don't think they've thought most of this through. But what ultimately is the point of any of this? If you're an activist type, then you're basically on a mission to kill a god with one cool shot. Why would you want my help? What could I possibly do? What, may I ask, would a political operator with the self-destruct codes for the global ruling class want from a nerd like me who writes video essays? Do you want me on the front lines of your protests? Would my small YouTube audience really make an ideal demo for MAGA 2.0? Does this make any sense? It actually doesn't make sense. That is, of course, unless said activists secretly know that their attacks on the cathedral aren't going to work. Unless what they're really looking for is an excuse not to try, or failing that, a convenient scapegoat to blame when their plan inevitably falls through. After all, nothing makes a better target for authorities than a middle-sized internet community with a loudmouth out front whose face and docs are readily available. And just as a related question, do you ever wonder why the internet calls exaggerated advocacy for real-life activism Fed posting? Do you think this is just a coincidence? For now, maybe we can just stay in our own lanes, at least until there are better answers to the questions I have raised here. I'm not trying to be antagonistic. I don't want to create bad blood on the right wing. I know there are good and decent people on both sides of the activist-pacifist divide. But in the meantime, for my own money, I'm going to leave this war behind and try something different. Perhaps instead of fighting, might someone find a better way of living? Nothing revolutionary, of course, just a modification of the perennial virtues we hear about from generations past. Divine simplicity for the plebeian, high-minded spiritualism for the patrician, and religion and folkways to bring the two together in synthesis. Is this impossible in modernity? Perhaps, but I have seen too many great examples in the flesh to believe that this is entirely prohibited to us today. The decision to pursue a deeper existence is an eternal good available to all people, and the absolute calling of all mankind. It is not simply an echo of some past age. As always, war and death rages on like a passing storm, but inside whatever conflict rules the moment, it is the discovery of eternal beauty and eternal goodness where true victory is really achieved.